Good. Welcome to Decoding Democracy Insights from 2024. We appreciate your taking time out of your afternoon or your morning or wherever you may be in the country to be with us. I'm Andrew Seligson, President of Public Agenda. We contribute to the health and strength of American democracy by connecting research to action. One way we do that is by bringing citizens together with people who, through research and practice, have come to understand critical aspects of how our democracy works and fails to work. And Decoding Democracy, an ongoing series of indeterminate length, is one such effort. The next Decoding Democracy event will be March 25 at 1 p.m. Eastern. The title for that event is Decoding Democracy, Who Do We Think We Are? And we will focus on Americans' perceptions of the demographics of the country and how those perceptions affect political attitudes and behavior. Today's event is focused on lessons we can learn from the 2024 election cycle, relating both to the practical administration of elections and the broader political and social culture in which our elections are situated. Through the first cycle of our Democracy Renewal Project, Public Agenda has asked over the last 18 months how we can achieve the broad access to elections democratic legitimacy requires, while also achieving the high levels of trust in elections democratic sustainability requires. That work has connected us to people leading both action and research related to those questions, and today's conversation enables all of us to hear from them and pose questions to them. We gather at a moment of extreme volatility in American political life as the blizzard of actions by the new administration affects nearly every institution, organization, and individual in the country. And that environment provides a strong reminder that elections have consequences. It also calls our attention to the crucial role of elections in creating accountability in a democracy. Elections are an opportunity for the citizenry to affirm the direction elected leaders are taking the country, or to check those leaders, but only if those elections are free, fair, and recognized to be free and fair by the vast majority. So our conversation today is not about the wisdom of the policies announced in the last 9 days. Instead, it's about the health of our electoral systems, processes, and cultures as we look toward the opportunities for citizens to pass judgment on those policies in 2026, 2028, and beyond. So we're going to proceed in 3 parts. Part 1 is a discussion with Ashley Kwaku, Executive Director of the Election Trust Initiative. For Part 2, I will hand things over to my colleague, Emily Sandusky, a director here at Public Agenda, for a conversation with 2 of the researchers involved in our Democracy Renewal Project, Mara Setman-Lee of Connecticut College and Chagai Weiss of Stanford University. And I should note that Leah Maravaki could not join us today due to a family emergency, and she expressed her disappointment at missing this conversation. Part 3 will be an opportunity for all of you to have your questions answered by our panelists. And so you can begin by putting your questions in the chat at any time during the conversation. And we will then, when we get there, pull those out and pose those questions to the panelists. You can either direct them to a particular panelist or to the group in general, and we'll do our best to get to as many of those questions as time allows. And so now it's my pleasure to welcome Ashley Kwaku to get started on the first phase of this conversation. Ashley, first of all, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And I want to get us started just by asking you to share with folks what the Election Trust Initiative is and how you were engaged in the 2024 election cycle.
Sure. Well, thanks, Andrew, and to the Public Agenda team for inviting me to participate in this important conversation. As noted, I'm the Executive Director of the Election Trust Initiative. We are a nonpartisan organization working to strengthen the field of election administration, and we do that in 3 primary ways. 1, we support evidence-based policy and practice. 2, we support strengthening the election workforce. And 3, we work to strengthen the field's resilience and connective tissue. And so we work in a long-term way. Our work is not necessarily focused on the sort of horse race part of the election process, cycle to cycle kinds of work. We really are supporting kind of the structural health and integrity of the field long term. And so we did have some activities underway this election cycle. Much of our work is actually kicking in now that the election is over, as we continue to do that field building work.
So let's kind of as a way of getting into 2024, maybe refocus everybody on what we were worried about in advance of it, right? There was great concern, partly in response to what had happened in 2020, in particular to some extent in 2022, that there would be unresolvable disputes and deep conflict over the outcome of the election, and that might lead to various forms of disorder that could interfere with the proper functioning of the election system as setting up a transfer of power. And obviously, it didn't quite go the way people feared. And I'm wondering if we could start by just talking about what is the good news in what happened? Like what's behind all that, and how should we understand the positive aspects of where we were in 24 and how that led to what did or didn't transpire.
Yeah, I think that many aspects of election administration during the 2024 election cycle were highly successful. We had very high voter turnout this election, very comparable to the record high that we saw in 2020. I think that's a success. Voting occurred, peacefully and efficiently in most jurisdictions with minimal disruptions, even though there were security threats that could have derailed things. That didn't really happen, and so things were able to kind of get back on track and continue with minimal disruption in places that were impacted by those security threats. The fear of poll worker shortages did not materialize. Election offices were staffed sufficiently. Votes were counted quickly for the most part. And in many jurisdictions, margins were wide enough where we had timely results, a decisive declaration of winners and losers. So I think, those are aspects to say that things that either happened in 2020 or that we were worried might happen did not necessarily materialize in this cycle. I will say, that it's a sort of remarkable that that many of this happened in such efficient and effective fashion, not because election officials weren't ready and prepared, but because of what they have endured over the last several years. This success really took place against a backdrop of terrible strains that have been ongoing for since 2020, unwarranted criticism of the integrity of the voting system, security threats against election officials and polling places, last-minute rule changes, court challenges, multiple natural disasters, and brazen interference by malign foreign actors. And so, we can look at the successes on their merits as being, yes, successes, but I think it's important to put those in a broader context and understand the environment, the long-term environment in which those successes took place. I think it makes it even more remarkable what was achieved.
Yeah, so let's talk about maybe what we failed to learn because of things that didn't manifest. So when you think about the kind of vulnerabilities that maybe the bullets we dodged, the things that didn't happen that were significant risks, the possibilities if people had been unhappy with outcomes, et cetera, that ended up not being. What are things that's kind of you see as still worrisome that were maybe covered up or covered over by the way that things went in this cycle?
Yes, I think, there were definitely challenges in different parts of the process. There were first, technical challenges, things that, are not likely to change outcomes, but they inconvenience voters and impact the voter experience. There were ballot printing errors, incorrect ballots. There were processing errors that led to long lines in some places. There were slow processing of same-day voter registration, similarly led to, just people being inconvenienced by lines and wait times, et cetera, negatively impacting thousands of voters. So I think we saw, a variety of technical things that really have to do with kind of quality control and checks in the system, and strains that I think, manifest because of what we've seen on the pressure on the workforce, the turnover in the workforce. That means we have lots of new people kind of stepping in and experiencing such pressure that some of these technical sort of checks didn't necessarily get, weren't necessarily always consistently done. So again, these are not things that impact results, but in an environment of, intense scrutiny and misinformation, these are the kinds of things where, narratives and sort of narratives around, election problems with the election fraud can be quickly spun up and come out of control if these things are not rectified or dealt with. I think the second thing that we saw was the security threats. And I think if you would talk to election officials about how they would characterize this election, this was the security election. There were the incendiary attacks on ballot boxes in the Northwest. There were 2 bomb threat campaigns. There were cyber and ransomware attacks, Russian foreign malign influence campaigns that disrupted voting in dozens of jurisdictions. Those things largely didn't penetrate, I think, the news cycle in ways that really showed what worked well, and the fact that there was really strong cooperation between election officials and law enforcement that enabled sort of, efficient evacuation of polling places and efficient kind of allowing people to return and finish their voting. So it didn't really disrupt people, but it could have been it could have been a disaster if any of those threats had turned out to be obviously meaningful, but also just it could have been much more even disruptive if we hadn't seen such really close coordination with law enforcement in those impacted jurisdictions. So I think I think that those are things that are going to endure. Certainly the security environment is going to be, I think, an enduring threat that's driven by the narrative environment that all of this work takes place in, which is, I think, thankfully kind of tamped down in the post-election period around how credible and how much trust people have in this result. And maybe that will impact the security environment. But I think this is a narrative that is easily mobilized again. And so we have to be prepared for sort of the similar kinds of threats that we saw in 2024.
How much of, I'm thinking about kind of as we look forward, and when you're describing this effective work connecting election officials with law enforcement, et cetera, how much of that is dependent on who holds various elected roles in specific jurisdictions? How much of that is pretty baked into kind of cultures that are secure and protect? How do you view that kind of range of issues as the environment is changing?
I think that there's really good experience from this election cycle to build on in ways that I think will be positive going forward on specifically on the cooperation with security and law enforcement. One of the strengths, I think, of our system is the sort of decentralized nature of the system. And so there are 10,000 jurisdictions across the country that are administering elections at any given time. And so it's very difficult, I think, thankfully, for any sort of individual set of challenges or threats to undermine or threaten the entire system. But it does require kind of this connective tissue, right, to exist really across the country in really localized kinds of ways. And so I think those local partnerships, those local relationships, they have been built over these last several years. I think we have to keep them active and keep squeezing them so that they remain durable and they're ready to kind of be mobilized, as we approach sort of the next series of cycles.
This is just for a peek behind the curtain for everybody in the audience. Ashley and I talked a little bit earlier, but it was before the court case that's now going on in North Carolina emerged about the legitimacy of 60,000 votes that are relevant to the outcome of a Supreme Court election that was decided by, I think, about 700 votes. And I think one of the concerns is that, and so I really, my point about this is, Ashley, if you don't have a lot to say about this, that's okay, because you had no preparation, and I don't think either one of us is an elections lawyer, et cetera. But I wondered about the question of, kind of what threats to, one of the main concerns that's been raised about that lawsuit is that everything, all of the facts about it were known well before the election, and the votes are being challenged after they were cast rather than an objection to the process that was being used in advance. And I'm wondering, do you have a sense of, across the country where there are lots of things lying in wait like this that might have cast real doubt on the election if the outcome had been different? Or does this seem to be anomalous? And again, how resilient is the system in that context? What concerns are there about the role of the judiciary in kind of securing elections when challenges emerge? How should we think about that set of issues?
Well, I certainly think that that election integrity does depend on people who are charged with who are charged with stewarding that process, in various different roles. That they're adhering to the rules-based nature of this system, and they're adhering to the processes that exist to, mediate disputes, et cetera. And certainly we didn't see necessarily that playing out in the North Carolina case, and with really, really problematic, implications. So I think obviously there's always a need to be aware of people who might seek to circumvent the rules-based system. I think that there are really important parts of the process, though, that can be useful in I think really valid parts of the process where candidates are allowed to contest a result. There are valid processes for contesting results, but there are also ways that we can make sure the system can adequately speak to the adequacy, right, of that result, and help to quickly resolve those problems and those questions on the basis of evidence, right, on the basis of, for example, the results of a high quality audit that can demonstrate right, that the ballots were counted correctly, and can show the sort of checks on the process. So I think that these are things that we're certainly at ETI, the Election Trust Initiative, really interested in helping to shore up. Where are those checks that can help hold up and prove the validity of the process when you do have actors who aren't necessarily going to again, abide by the rules-based system.
What would you like citizens? We have a lot of very informed, active citizens on this conversation. What would you like people to know about roles they can play in ensuring free and fair elections that are trustworthy and trusted?
I'd say, first of all, continue to participate as a citizen in voting in the way that you feel most confident, and know that your vote matters, and know that it will be counted accurately. I'd say second, get to know your local election official. In many cases, they're going to be your neighbor. They're public servants. They don't get paid very much, and they do this work because they're passionate about serving their communities and facilitating your access to the democratic process. They've had a rough time over the last 4+ years. So it's nice to send them a thank you note or find some way to express appreciation. And I think, find out ways to learn about the process and the checks that exist on the process, and be a validator to that process on behalf of your own community. Encourage friends or family that that may be have have questions about the process, encourage them to do a tour or to volunteer as a poll worker or as a nonpartisan election observer. There's so many, I think, expanding ways that people can learn about elections, can get their questions answered. And I think if you can help to be a liaison to some of those processes within your own communities, you can do great service to the election community.
Well, Ashley, thank you both for chatting with me a little bit today, as well as for the incredibly important work that ETI has been doing. I think one of the stories about how all this came to be, that we had a successful election, is that the philanthropic community, the nonprofit community, et cetera, rallied to work with public officials to try to build resiliency. And I think it has paid off. And obviously, we need more of it as we go forward. So thank you. And I know you're going to stick around so you can help us all answer questions, which I appreciate. As I hand it off to Emily, I will just remind everybody, if you want to start putting questions for Ashley or others in the chat, you can go ahead and do that. That is the way we will surface questions of yours for the next phase. And right now, I will turn it over to Emily Sandusky.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much, Andrew and Ashley. I'm excited to talk with Mara Sutman-Lee and Hagai Weiss, two of the researchers doing work for the Democracy Renewal Project. Okay. Find Hagai. There you are. Nice to see you both. All right, well, I just want to get started with you introducing your research focus and approach during the 2024 election. So to just describe a little bit of what you were hoping to learn from 2024. Mara, why don't you start, and then Hagai, you can go second.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. And of course, many thanks to Public Agenda for supporting my research. I'm Mara Sutman-Lee. I'm an associate professor at Connecticut College and an Andrew Carnegie Fellow, class of 2024. As we said at the top of the call, my co-author, Leah Maravaki, who is at Georgetown University, unfortunately could not be here. Broadly, I'm a political scientist. I study how election policy shapes the administration of elections, how election administration then in turn shapes access to voting. And the thing that Leah Maravaki and I have been focused on in 2024, but also for the last couple of years, is what election officials do to inform voters about election policy, about what's needed to vote, about security measures that are in place, and about how ballots are tallied and results are arrived at. And so in 2024, we officially launched what we call the Election Official Communications Tracker. I feel like we might need a pithier, more effective title, but it's a massive data collection effort where we track and analyze communications from state and local election officials on social media. So that's 50 states plus the US territories, as well as the, Ashley mentioned, the 10,000 election jurisdictions. Now, not all local election offices are on social media, but there's still a lot that we are collecting and tracking. And during 2024, between September and November, we observed the information that election officials were sharing across different social media platforms. We're looking currently to identify specific patterns and variations across the states and within states. At this point, we are still sifting through all of that data, but that's where we are right now. And it's become a really invaluable resource for us and our colleagues in election science who want to better understand what election officials are actually communicating with their constituents.
Yeah, can you describe your work around the election?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much, Emily and Andrew and everyone for being here and for supporting our research. So my name is Hagai. I'm a political scientist by training and a postdoc at Stanford. A lot of my work focuses on how we can bridge between groups in conflict, broadly defined, around the world. And in the run-up to the 2024 election, together with Rob Willer at Stanford and Don Green at Columbia University, we were kind of interested in exploring the potential of elite bipartisan appeals to depolarize voters, increase trust in the electoral system and process, and ultimately kind of lower the temperature of political competition. In order to do so, we set up to design a new type of experimental approach where we onboarded people to surveys. We then kind of collected their personal information, sent them various campaigns on behalf of the National Governors Association that were really advocating for Americans to disagree better. I'm sure we'll get to kind of elaborate on what that means exactly further along. But then we kind of went back to those folks after they received some exposure to these types of ads and evaluated the extent to which they ultimately are persuaded, they shift their general attitudes and their behaviors. And kind of, I would say that some of the core insights that we find are that ultimately folks that are exposed to the NGA Disagree Better campaign were more likely to recall the campaign and, in line with its underlying message, engage in various bipartisan behaviors, such as writing their governor, advocating for a more tolerant political culture, joining bipartisan listservs, reporting or opting into bipartisan conversations. But we don't find deep attitudinal change on other outcomes. And I think I'd be happy to elaborate on that as we kind of get along.
So I know one of the things that's really on my mind is thinking about how far the work we're talking about today can take us toward building a healthy democracy. So Mara, I'm wondering kind of, what do you think? How far can efforts to improve election administration take us in the larger goal to strengthen the health of our democracy?
Yeah, this is a really important question, of course, and one that I spend a lot of time thinking about, especially when I'm trying to answer the does this matter? Does my work matter question? Yes. And more importantly, the work that election officials do matter. I think that the thing that I would spotlight is that it is worth continuing to improve election administration because election administrators are the backbone of the physical backbone of our democratic system. When it comes to elections, they would not run, they would not function without them. And the processes that Ashley was describing earlier, I think really highlight that, how much they do to actually ensure that your vote, your voice actually counts. And so I think, though, that there are limitations on what we should expect of them. And I think that our improvements to election administration should really revolve around helping them improve upon the work that they are tasked with, not adding additional things for them to do. So the focus of my research, voter education, most election officials really enjoy doing it. They like talking to their constituents. They like helping them figure out how to vote. They like educating them about the process. But there's also this really important question about, should they be more involved in encouraging voting and encouraging civic education? And I think on that point, it's important that election officials don't do this work alone. We've already talked briefly about the different NGOs and research outfits that have risen up to support the work of election officials. But the running of free, fair, secure elections, this is necessary for a healthy democracy, but it's not sufficient. And so I think that when it comes to, the goal of improving election administration, we should be realistic about what we should expect our election administrators to do. They serve a really important function. The work that they do to connect with their voters does help. It does matter. It helps voters make sure that they don't make mistakes. And it does bolster their confidence in election outcomes, but it's certainly not sufficient.
How about on your end, Agai, how far can these efforts to kind of turn down the temperature around election season in this case take us toward building a healthy democracy? And I know maybe you could answer that both from kind of empirical findings, what you're learning, and also from your kind of broader sense of where your work fits into the big picture.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. So I think in order to answer this question, we need to think critically about what democracy is and how we think of it. Are we thinking of a minimalist definition of democracy, which is, democracy as a system that allows candidates to lose and the kind of structure of governing to change over time and have competitive elections? And our project didn't focus directly on that, right? We focused on a second order kind of element of democracy, which is the political culture where these electoral competitions unfold. And in that sense, I think this type of work is important because culture matters. It impacts the way people understand the kind of procedural system, how they respect it or not. And for that reason, on a conceptual level, without getting to our findings, I think that understanding how we can align citizens' incentives and kind of social and political preferences with a kind of lower temperature, but still competitive and clearly defined electoral process is important in and of itself. On the empirical side, I would say that, we find clear effects on some outcomes. People change their behaviors. They're engaging in various types of civic behaviors that I think many of us might agree are important. But these effects are also very small. And we have good reason from a lot of work on persuasion across subfields to expect that these effects are not only small, but they decay very quickly. And in that sense, when I think of the type of work that we're doing, evaluating campaign messages, I think of them as kind of one element of a broader set of policies and initiatives and organizations that are kind of meant to complement one another and facilitate a better political culture. So empirically, I do think this matters, but I don't think it's a silver bullet or I don't think it's a one and only one solution. I really think we need to think about this in a comprehensive fashion, thinking about how different approaches complement one another.
In your initial description, Hagai, you talked about the difference between what people do, sign up for bipartisan listservs, maybe write a letter to their governor, and there's a small effect. People who see the ads are slightly more likely there to do that, maybe.
Yeah.
But then you said it didn't change kind of underlying attitudes.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you can kind of dig into that a little bit, into that difference.
Totally. Yeah. So I think, first of all, before I dig into it, I will say that this is I think one of the kind of it's a central open question for folks who study persuasion and conflict resolution, specifically using various kind of experimental approaches. Why is it that in some recent studies, we see this pattern by which it's easier to get people to engage in specific behaviors than to change their underlying beliefs? And I have kind of two different suggestions, none of which are fully grounded and bulletproof. But one which kind of relates to the type of study that we ran is you need to consider the nature of the ads that we were televising. Our ads really called people to disagree better. They kind of presented a Democrat and a Republican governor, acknowledging their ideological differences, but saying hey, we are in conversation with one another and we could, talk about tax credits, or we can talk about public goods provision. And we encourage you to do the same and find someone and be in conversation. And in that sense, the primary call to action and the kind of underlying message of this campaign was find a way to disagree better, find a way to be in conversation with someone else. And while we collected various outcomes such as hatred to the other party, trust in elections, support of undemocratic candidates, a lot of these outcomes weren't directly discussed in the campaign. For various reasons that I'd be happy. I think it's very interesting to discuss why that is. But in that sense, I think that that's one reason why we see people taking up this behavior, because that's what they were told to do by these highly salient authority figures. But then there's another element that's beyond this type of study that kind of thinks more deeply about behaviors and attitudes. And kind of my understanding of this is that sometimes we hold beliefs that are really hard to change. Our beliefs are kind of acquired in early age socialization. They're often informed by, partisan segregation or, racial and ethnic segregation, recurring exposure to, elections that polarize voters. And in that sense, oftentimes when you're reaching, the age of 30 or 40 or 50, your beliefs are kind of hardwired. That being said, sometimes these types of behaviors that are not like, dramatic behaviors like buying a house in a new city or like deciding to vote for another candidate, they're kind of lower cost behaviors might be easier to change because, um, ultimately, maybe people are kind of curious, but they just never had the opportunity or the kind of small push to kind of like be in conversation with another person. And what the campaign here was able to do is kind of make that top of mind for people, encourage them. The next time you have an opportunity, try to be a bit more curious and talk to someone else. And that's part of why I think we see this gap.
Mara, I wonder what, you have done a wide range of work in 2024, but kind of has anything in specific stuck out to you that kind of from the learning around 2024 that has shifted your understanding of American democracy or shifted your understanding of the ways we can support American democracy? Is there a salient change?
A salient change in 2024 relative to previous election cycles.
Yeah, for you, kind of from the research that you did.
Yeah, I think that taking both what Leah and I observed, have observed thus far in our evaluation of EO communications, this election cycle, they were incredibly responsive to natural disasters, to security threats. Since 2022, we have only seen, when we also did the same work, we've only seen an increase in the coordination in their messaging across states and even within the same state, the professionalization of their messaging. I often sort of describe the transformation that election official communications have undergone over the last couple of years as one that's almost akin to them having to kind of become like political campaigners. Not that they're running for office, although some of them do, but not as a part of their official responsibilities. But in the sense that their messaging really has to take on that campaign or marketing like quality. And so I think that that's something that really stood out to me, at least in terms of my own understanding of the direction that that particular field is going and that communications in that field is also going. I think though 2024 did highlight for me the limits of their communication efforts. Insofar as putting out communications that encourage the public to think about the broader significance of the vote and what the vote means, and the role of civic engagement in democratic life. And that sort of speaks to what I was mentioning earlier, which is I think that to expect election officials to focus on those kinds of communications and then to be able to do so effectively is a pretty tall order for them. And so I think that 2024 definitely taught me that I would like to see a renewed focus on the development of a more common set of values, of democratic values that we can share even as we disagree with one another, from my perspective as it pertains to the act of voting and what that means and what elections actually mean and signify.
Okay, I'll ask you the same question, but before I do so, I want to let everyone know that after this, we'll move on to an opportunity to have your questions asked to Ashley, Mara, and Hagai. And so I see a few questions in the chat, excuse me, but if anyone else has them, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'd love to direct your questions to the experts here with us. So Hagai, the same question for you. Kind of what has what you've learned through your research in the 2024 election, how has it shifted your ideas about American democracy or shifted your ideas about how we can do work to support the resilience of US democracy?
Yeah. So it's funny, like sometimes when you run these kind of large scale, super intensive experiments, it turns out that a lot of the most kind of insightful things that you learn are from the process of implementation and not only from the results themselves, which are important in and of itself. But one thing that I've learned is from the process of implementation here, we were testing messages that politicians kind of agreed upon together to put out publicly and kind of broadcast to the general public. And it turns out that in a polarized political system, the nature of the message and its broader scope and the extent to which it relates to important, albeit kind of polarized issues such as electoral integrity, respect for institutions, respect for procedural processes. The extent to which that could come up in a 30-second ad and where both Democrat and Republican candidates kind of agree on the message and are willing to kind of sign off on it together, that is a very narrow scope. And one of the things that I think I've come to learn from this project, and we're kind of working on further exploring this and thinking about how to think about this theoretically and how to think about it in an applied fashion, is to think about how we can align politicians' incentives with respect for democratic institutions. How can we align, politicians in a polarized era to be able to say, I realize that this is a real risk for me with 20% of my electorate or 10% of my electorate or with a subset of Congress folks, but still my incentive is, different. And I'm fully committed to this set of institutions or democratic norms. And yeah, we're thinking about this now creatively in various ways. One of the ways that we're thinking about this is it actually turns out that, participating in these types of messages and ads and kind of engaging in bipartisanship is definitely not harming electoral representatives or governors. And it might be kind of actually improving their reputation amongst the broad electorate and kind of helping politicians internalize that and realize that there actually is demand for reasonable, lower temperature, respectful politics, is something that we're really excited about doing. And, it's not only politicians, right, this is a kind of complex problem. There are incentives that are driven by media. How could you play with those incentives or kind of change those incentives in a way that actually kind of ultimately lead politicians to be a bit more respectful of the democratic process. And again, coming to your first point, this isn't this wouldn't resolve all the problems in a polarized society, but it would improve the political culture, which I think is important in and of itself. So yeah, that's kind of how, I think that's the core insight that I learned and I'm kind of sitting with right now.
Thank you so much to you both for condensing your vast kind of experience and knowledge into these few minutes in this particular set of questions. Right, so let's open the floor for more questions. I know that we have a list from the chat and from some communication with the audience before this event. Andrew, why don't you go for it?
Thank you very much, Emily. And yeah, really appreciated that conversation. And as Emily said, taking a lot of stuff, condensing it quickly. So we'll try to keep doing that, understanding that this is kind of the tip of the iceberg and that hopefully people will be inspired to learn more about your work and go find out what you've been up to. Let me start. And as Emily said, some of these have come in through the chat. Some came in through a question we posed during the registration process. Do a little mixing and matching. Let me start, I think the whole kind of context for this conversation, explicitly or otherwise, is the polarized backdrop to all of these electoral processes. And I think one of the big conversations that goes on in at least the worlds that those of us who think all day about our democracy is about where the greatest leverage is. Sort of cultural approaches, things that Hagai has been talking about, communications that can help people understand and participate better, or kind of structural changes, things like ranked choice voting processes or nonpartisan redistricting, things that for various reasons kind of change the incentives and may have depolarizing effects. And I'm wondering from all of your perspectives, just what, nobody's expected to resolve that question, but just, yeah, what might you have to say about where the greatest opportunities are in changing some of the rules of the game to change the incentives, or in doing things within the existing rules to help people understand them better and think differently about their roles? And I will throw that open to the three of you. So anybody who wants to jump first, I invite you to do so. don't. Okay, Guy, go
Yeah.
ahead.
I think about this a lot because I just wrapped up my kind of dissertation-based book that focuses on institutional approaches for prejudice reduction. And I think there's a lot of promise for, these kind of like structural and institutional approaches. They're compelling because they're top down. They're, at scale already, right? The state has, these institutions that affect everyone. But it turns out that like you need incentives for those types of institutional changes. And there's a lot of losers that stand to lose a lot from those changes. So like I'm all in for saying like, thinking structurally about these issues and institutionally about these issues is really promising because, they could have massive effects. Moving to a PR system theoretically could have massive effects. But my point of skepticism there is that oftentimes these types of changes do not happen in order to improve intergroup relations in a society. They happen because some political actor stands to benefit politically from that change. And that opens up a really interesting question to which I don't think I have an answer yet, which is like, how do you align the political incentive of like increasing political power or returns from the change with the like societal incentives? And yeah, that's something that I think is unresolved for me. But at a more general perspective, I think that there's a lot. I think that these are all complements. Like, I think that, it would be a fool's errand to like focus only on cultural aspects or only on grassroots civil society approaches or only on institutional approaches. I really do think that they are complements and that a lot of them also are not as distinct as we think they are. A lot of institutional processes actually trigger psychological dynamics that we often associate with grassroots initiatives. So yeah, so I don't think that's an answer, but it's a perspective.
Yeah, I cannot pretend to have an answer either. I'm actually sitting looking at a book right now that offers a very bold answer, at least when it comes to the strategic incentives that candidates and parties have for levying the kinds of election lawsuits, for example, that we were talking about, what's happening in North Carolina currently. It's called A Real Right to Vote. It's by Rick Hasen, who is one of the most esteemed election law scholars in the United States. And essentially his argument is that if we, somehow we're able to overcome the strategic and incentive barriers to the passage of such an amendment, a constitutional actual affirmative right to vote, would address a lot of these more nitpicky challenges that are brought, in lead up to elections and the aftermath of elections, that threaten to and often do disenfranchise voters because it takes away that incentive to actually engage in those challenges. But to Hagai's point, at least in my own work on election reform and policy and changes, it is rare that I come across policy changes in election law that don't revolve around some sort of strategic incentives. There's a class I teach called The Politics of Voting Reforms that's on election administration, but it's called The Politics of Voting Reforms for a reason. And so I do wonder, though, and this is an open, this is kind of more of a half-baked thought at this point, but thinking about the results of the 2024 election, and wondering if the winner effect that we saw among Republican voters in particular, if you look at some of the top line findings on voter confidence, major shifts in confidence in ballot counting and in election administration among Republicans, and only sort of slightly dips among Democrats that would be normal for someone who selected a losing candidate for the most part. I do wonder if this election might afford us, at least from the voting access, voting rights perspective, a chance to push for more accessible reforms, because in this election, at least at the presidential level and in, obviously many of the House races, turnout was a boon for Republicans. So I don't think you're going to get rid of those strategic incentives, though, anytime soon. At least on the matter of voting, without something like a constitutional amendment.
I'm happy. Ashley, I didn't know if you had anything you wanted to add, or I can throw another. Yeah, go
Well,
ahead.
I would just, my only contribution here is just to bring a little bit of my prior life into the discussion, which is having worked sort of internationally on democracy and peace building programs. And just to plus one on Hagai's point about needing a sort of series of complementary approaches. And one of the things that the international peace building kind of experience tells us is that when a country is kind of going through a major transition out of sort of political conflict or conflict of any kind, social conflict, that you do need a very holistic approach. You have to, you need the sort of interpersonal, person to person kinds of things, grassroots. You need kind of intergroup work that that deals at that level. You need structural and institutional reform too, and you often see those kinds of major things happen: constitutional reform, decentralization reforms in that context to resolve some of those things. So just a plus one on that very holistic approach.
The next question I think is a little more grounded, so that may be helpful to everybody. Although I learned a lot from those responses, so I appreciate it. And maybe I'll throw it first to Ashley, but then I'm interested in all three of your responses, which is about what is the role of journalists in all this? Is there, I mean, I'm interested, Ashley, at a practical level, what you have seen in the way that journalists have played a role, positive, negative, otherwise, in the processes of kind of trust building in partnership with election administrators. But then obviously, Mara and Hagai, you're both thinking in different ways about the communications landscape in all this. So maybe start with Ashley and then move to Mara and Hagai.
Sure. This is not an area that we work closely in, but I will say that I think we've seen the sort of journalism sector move really far this cycle towards knowing more about how to talk to the public about how elections work in ways that were informed by actual, truth, good information about those processes, and sort of getting out ahead and really local journalism doing that. I think that's been a big success, sort of seeing local newscasters talk about an audit and explain why the audit either, showed something that maybe there was a discrepancy, but why this discrepancy does or doesn't matter. And I think those kinds of things where it's really hyper localized can do a lot of good to help build people's trust in the system. Local journalists do have a lot of trust in the communities where they're based.
Yeah, I will echo the local connections aspect of this. I've got some research with Leah Maravaki and Rachel Ore suggesting that folks who prefer to get their news and information from local sources, from their election officials about elections and from local news sources, do express higher confidence in the electoral process. The Debbie Downer caveat, though, that I'll add to that, unfortunately, is that we've seen the capacity of local newsrooms gutted in recent years. And so this work absolutely needs to continue. Ashley is absolutely correct that local newsrooms in particular, I think, have done a really good job of reporting on election processes, things like audits or logic and accuracy tests, these things that none of us were really thinking about up until a couple of years ago. And at the same time, there are real concerns that I have about their continued capacity for doing that. So it's work that needs to keep happening, and emphasizing those local connections, I think, is really a foundationally important way for cultivating trust in the electoral process. And at the same time, there are real questions about the resources that newsrooms and, frankly, local election officials will have, following this particular election cycle.
Yeah, maybe I'll just respond shortly. This isn't like my area of expertise, but I'll respond with two insights that I think complement one another and kind of tell the importance of like journalism and media. So I think there's a growing body of evidence internationally showing that the decline of local media and local news is a cause of polarization. And the other kind of interesting kind of piece of data or findings that I think is really telling is some work by David Brockman and Josh Kalla, who kind of paid folks to kind of go off Fox News or go on CNN, and they like find massive effects on people's like attitudes and preferences when they kind of are off one kind of relatively, I would say, divisive kind of media platforms, suggesting that really what we consume and what citizens consume really affects how they see the world. And I think that's an area where we need to do a lot more kind of rigorous evaluation and kind of thinking creatively of like, how do we get folks to like consume information that is relatively objective, nonpartisan, informative, empowering. Because I think, unfortunately, my read is that like this is not this is not only a Fox News issue. I think it's a broader like issue of many media platforms. A lot of them are not truly empowering, objective, kind of informative, or definitely not as much as we would want them to be.
So we have time, I think, for essentially one lightning round type question. So it'll be an unfairly difficult one also to conclude. And this is kind of condensing various things that people have thrown out. I'm just interested if you could say, as you look toward 2026, 2028, what you think of as the highest priority areas where we might make some progress, say in that time frame, to ensure that those two election cycles are fair and free and are seen as fair and free by as many Americans as is possible. So where do you think the greatest opportunities are and the greatest need in that way? And I give you all a moment to think. I'll filibuster. Chagai is unmuted, so maybe I will turn to you first.
Okay, I'll just, this is obviously imperfect because it's a tough question, but thinking about how we can align citizens, politicians, and media incentives with kind of respecting our institutions and understanding that if we can do that, we are all kind of destined to benefit from, a continuing strong and kind of productive society is something that I've been thinking a lot.
I think my answer would just be to continue to rally around and support election officials in their ability to execute faithfully the election process, which, and to be able to withstand scrutiny. I think we know it's going to be scrutinized and especially in a closer kind of contest. So I think we should anticipate the closer contest, we should anticipate the scrutiny, and we should prepare the field to be able to respond to that.
I was gonna say essentially the same thing. It's sort of the low hanging fruit. You had asked what's the most obvious thing or straightforward thing that we should focus on over the next couple of years. And yes, continue to support election officials. I think that the outcome of the 2024 election bought us some time, but that doesn't mean what we call the playbook of election misinformation, challenging election results has gone away. And it looks like, we will have closely contested elections. The House is very, very narrowly divided currently, and the Senate races that were close this election cycle were very, very close. And I think that will be happening for the foreseeable future. And so continuing to not only support the election administration infrastructure as is, but do whatever we can as citizens, as researchers, as members of different democracy stakeholder organizations to encourage others to support that work is really foundational before we think of anything else. I mean, in an ideal world, I would love for high quality civic education programs every single elementary, middle school, and high school, but we're talking realistically here. So those are my thoughts.
I'd like to believe that last idea is not as pie in the sky as you're suggesting, but here we are. Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you, Mara, Chagai, Ashley, for sharing. I realized just a tiny little bit of what you know and what you've learned. We really appreciate it. And thanks as well to Leah in absentia, who I know contributed to the work that Mara discussed. Thanks to all of you for joining us for the conversation. Our next event in the series, as I mentioned, will be March 25. And if you point your phone at that QR code, you can go straight to the registration. We try to simplify things for all of you. A big part of our view at Public Agenda is that a nonpartisan movement for the health and strength of our democracy will be a key pathway to all of the kinds of positive changes that our panelists were discussing today. And we think that having these kinds of conversations is helpful in building that shared understanding of where we can work together to try to strengthen our democracy. So thanks again for being here. We'd love to see you next time. That's all. Bye-bye.